Welcome to our channel, a place where true scary stories are told in a quiet, haunting, and deeply unsettling way. If you enjoy late-night chills, dim lights, and slipping into unresolved mysteries, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Now let the lights soften, let your body relax, and let your breathing slow down. Settle in, and enjoy the stories that follow. Wishing you a peaceful night and sweet dreams. Someone was knocking. That night, rain fell without pause on the narrow road cutting through the forest north of Hollow Creek, Pennsylvania. The headlights of an old sedan smeared pale light across the wet asphalt, reflecting off tree trunks that stood like silent black pillars in the dark. Ethan Walker sat behind the wheel, his hands gripping it tightly, exhaustion weighing heavily on his eyelids after a long day. He could not remember how long he had been driving, only that the rain kept thickening, the wind battered the windshield, and fatigue settled over his thoughts like a dense fog. The last clear moment Ethan remembered was the sudden blare of a horn somewhere in the darkness, followed by a burst of blinding white light and the sensation of the world spinning violently. Then everything went dark. When Ethan opened his eyes, the sharp smell of disinfectant filled his lungs. A white hospital ceiling hovered above him beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Pain radiated through his body, especially his head and chest, and every breath felt heavy, as if his lungs were being pressed inward. A police officer stood beside his bed, speaking calmly, explaining that Ethan had been involved in a severe accident and that his survival was considered extraordinary. They told him he was a rare case. His car had been almost completely destroyed. The rescue team had not believed anyone could still be alive inside. Ethan listened and nodded weakly. His mind felt hollow, as though something important had been carefully removed. The days that followed passed in a haze. Ethan remained in the hospital for more than a month. Doctors said his recovery was unusual but positive. His injuries healed quickly. His vital signs remained stable, though somewhat atypical. His heart rate stayed unusually low. His skin was often cold, even in warm rooms. When he asked about it, the doctors said every body responded differently to trauma. Ethan returned to his old wooden house on the outskirts of Hollow Creek on a gray afternoon, the sky hanging low and heavy over the town. The house sat alone at the edge of the forest, surrounded by abandoned land. He had lived there for years, accustomed to its quiet isolation. But on the very first night back, Ethan sensed something was wrong. The knocking began at 3:17 a.m. The sound was dry and deliberate. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 2 more. Ethan woke in the darkness, his heart beating slowly, but with unsettling weight. He sat up and listened. The knocking came again, clearer now, as if someone stood directly at the front door. Barefoot, he crossed the cold wooden floor and reached for the handle. When he opened the door, damp night air rushed in. No one stood outside. The dirt path leading into the forest was empty, mist drifting through the trees. But something remained, the smell of wet earth. Fresh soil after rain, thick and heavy, mixed with the scent of rusted metal. Ethan stood frozen for several seconds, nausea rising in his throat, before closing the door and convincing himself it must have been a mistake or a meaningless disturbance. The following night, the knocking returned. Again at exactly 3:17 a.m. The same rhythm. And again, when Ethan opened the door, there was no one. Only that same damp, earthen smell lingering in the air, seeping into the house. Ethan installed a security camera facing the entrance. On the third night, he stayed awake, sitting in the living room, eyes fixed on the screen. When the clock struck 3:17, the door trembled slightly. The knocking echoed through the house. On the monitor, the porch was completely empty. No figure, no movement, nothing to explain the sound. After a week, it grew worse. The knocking no longer came from the front door. One night, Ethan lay in bed when he heard it again, closer this time. The sound came from his bedroom door. He sat upright, a chill crawling up his spine. The knocking sounded as though someone stood just outside in the dark hallway. He opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the smell of wet soil was stronger than ever, as if someone had tracked it through the house. In the nights that followed, the knocking moved. Sometimes it came from the closet door, sometimes from beneath the floorboards. One night, it came from inside the wall near his bed, accompanied by another sound, faint, slow, like fingernails gently scraping against wood. Ethan stopped sleeping. He feared the dark, feared the silence between the knocks. Damp marks appeared on the floor near his bed, though he was certain he had not brought anything inside. Sometimes he woke to find dirt beneath his fingernails, with no memory of touching it. Desperate, Ethan went to the local police station. Detective Laura Bennett received him, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a tired expression. When Ethan mentioned the accident, something flickered across her face, just briefly enough for him to notice. She said the case had been closed. Everything had been handled according to procedure, but her voice sounded rehearsed, as if she were repeating lines she had memorized long ago. That night, Ethan returned to the station. He knew he should not be there, but fear overpowered reason. He slipped into the records room and searched through old files until he found his name. The final accident report lay waiting. His name, the date, the location. The document stated plainly that the victim had not survived at the scene due to severe trauma. The time of confirmation was listed as 3:02 a.m. The body had been transferred shortly afterward. Ethan read the report again and again, the ground seeming to give way beneath him. At the bottom was Laura Bennett's signature. The memories returned in fragments, out of order. The crushing pressure, the lack of air, the suffocating darkness, and the knocking, not from outside, but from within. Ethan remembered awareness in the darkness, unable to move, unable to speak. He remembered the smell of soil, the sound of dirt falling onto a wooden surface above him. He remembered trying to knock, weakly, desperately, hoping someone would hear. What returned to the house in Hollow Creek was not a survivor in the ordinary sense. It was Ethan's consciousness, clinging stubbornly to a body that no longer truly belonged to the living world. On the final night, the knocking was louder than ever. No longer from the door, no longer from the walls. It came from inside Ethan himself. Each heartbeat struck like a knock. Slow, heavy, rhythmic. He stood before the bathroom mirror and stared at his reflection. Gray skin, sunken eyes, cracked lips, and when he breathed, the familiar smell of wet earth escaped with each exhale. The next morning, neighbors called the authorities about an unusual odor coming from the wooden house. Inside, they found Ethan Walker lying motionless on his bed. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. The time was estimated to be more than 2 weeks earlier, and in that quiet house, no knocking was ever heard again. The reflection. Ethan Caldwell moved to Ashwood in early autumn, when the small town in Vermont began to sink into shades of brown and gray, leaves falling silently beneath pale morning fog. The narrow, winding roads, the aging wooden houses tucked beneath towering maple trees, and the near-total quiet made Ashwood feel less like a living community and more like a place the world had forgotten. Ethan chose it because the house prices were low, because he could work remotely, and most of all because he believed he needed somewhere quiet enough to reorganize his life after a marriage that had quietly fallen apart. The house he bought stood apart from the center of town, a 2-story wooden structure that had clearly been unoccupied for years. The scent of damp would lingered in the walls, but Ethan didn't mind. To him, the age of the house felt comforting, as if its long past could absorb the heavier thoughts he carried with him. One drizzling afternoon, while driving back from town, Ethan noticed a weathered wooden sign leaning at the edge of the road, Holloway Antiques. The shop was small, dim yellow light spilling weakly through a dusty front window. He hadn't planned to stop anywhere, but something about the place made him slow down, then pull over. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and rusted metal. Objects were stacked everywhere, without any clear order. Behind the counter, an elderly woman looked up at him. Her silver hair was tied low, her eyes deep set, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. Ethan didn't know why his attention fixed on the mirror resting against the back wall. It had a thick oak frame carved with simple, restrained patterns. The glass itself wasn't entirely clear, as if a thin layer of mist permanently clung to its surface. "That mirror," Ethan said, his voice hesitant. "Where does it come from?" The woman followed his gaze and remained silent for a few seconds before answering. She said it came from an old house in Maine. The previous owner had left in a hurry, abandoning most of their belongings. She didn't elaborate, and Ethan didn't press her. Sometimes, vagueness was more reassuring than detail. He bought the mirror and brought it home that evening. He hung it in the bedroom, directly across from the bed, then stepped back to look at it. The reflection was muted but clear enough to show him standing there, tired but whole. The first night passed normally. So did the second. It wasn't until the third morning that Ethan sensed something was off, though he couldn't immediately explain why. Standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his collar, he blinked and felt that the reflection blinked a fraction of a second later. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. Ethan frowned and blinked again. This time, everything seemed normal. He laughed quietly at himself, assuming it was poor lighting or lack of sleep. His work often kept him up late, and insomnia had followed him for years. But the feeling didn't go away. Over the next few days, Ethan began paying closer attention. When he tilted his head, the reflection followed, always slightly delayed. When he raised his hand to his neck, the image did the same, but as if it had to decide first. The delay wasn't enough to provoke panic, but it was enough to plant a persistent, uncomfortable doubt in Ethan's mind. He tested it. Standing in front of the mirror, he lifted his arm quickly. The reflection kept up, but Ethan was certain there was a brief moment when the image stood still, as if watching him. His sleepless nights grew more frequent. Lying in bed, facing the mirror, he tried to avoid looking at himself. Sometimes he covered the mirror with a thin cloth before sleeping. In the morning, the cloth lay neatly folded on the floor, as if someone had carefully removed it. Ethan began doubting himself. Maybe he had done it in a half-asleep state. Maybe he was imagining things. He didn't tell anyone. He already knew the answer he'd hear: stress, exhaustion, the need for rest. Then the expressions began to change. One evening, after a long day of work, Ethan stood brushing his teeth. When he looked up, the reflection wasn't meeting his gaze. Its eyes seemed focused on something just beyond him, somewhere behind his shoulder. Ethan leaned slightly to the left. The reflection followed, but the eyes remained fixed. A chill crept up his spine. After that, the differences became harder to ignore. When Ethan relaxed his face, the reflection tightened its mouth. When he frowned from a headache, the image in the mirror stayed neutral, as if it didn't understand the reaction. Ethan avoided standing in front of the mirror for long. But the bedroom was small, and the mirror occupied most of the wall across from the bed. He couldn't avoid seeing it, even at the edge of his vision. That night, after hours of restless wakefulness, Ethan got up and stood before the mirror. The yellow light cast soft shadows across the oak frame. He stared into the reflection, trying to reclaim the familiar sense that it was still him. Then, without warning, the reflection smiled. The smile appeared before Ethan felt any movement in his own face. The corners of the reflected mouth lifted slowly, deliberately. The eyes didn't change. There was no warmth in them. Ethan froze. His heart pounded so loudly, he could hear it in his ears. A moment later, he realized his own mouth was smiling too, late, automatic, unwilling. He stepped back, then another step. The reflection didn't move closer, but its gaze never left him. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat in a chair with his back to the mirror, the light on until morning. When he finally gathered the courage to face the mirror again the next day, everything had changed. The reflection no longer imitated him. Ethan raised his hand. The figure in the mirror stayed still. He tilted his head, bent down, stepped sideways. The reflection remained where it was, following him only with its eyes, calm, observant, unsettlingly patient. The sensation of being watched, of being evaluated, made Ethan feel small and out of place in his own room. In a panic, he drove back down the same road, searching for the antique shop. But the building stood abandoned. The sign was rotted, the windows thick with dust. A nearby resident told him the shop had closed long ago, and that a woman named Margaret Holloway hadn't been seen in town for more than 10 years. Ethan returned home after dark. The house felt quieter than ever. That night, he heard a soft tapping sound, like fingertips brushing against glass, coming from the bedroom. He didn't open the door. The next morning, Ethan shattered the mirror. The glass broke into fragments that scattered across the floor, but none of them reflected his image. They were dull, gray shards, cold and empty. Life slowly returned to routine. Ethan continued working, continued living. But something had changed. He no longer flinched at sudden noises. Bright light didn't make him blink. Small, instinctive reactions had quietly left him. One morning, walking past the glass window of a cafe in town, Ethan caught sight of his reflection. For a very brief moment, the image lagged behind him by a fraction of a second. Ethan stopped, and for the first time in days he smiled. The smile appeared on his face first. Only afterward did the feeling of wanting to smile arrive. In that moment, Ethan understood that the mirror had never truly disappeared. It simply no longer needed glass or a frame to exist. The forgotten. Night always fell earlier than people expected in the small town in Vermont. As soon as the sun slipped behind the old maple trees, darkness spread across the empty streets and settled over the silent wooden houses. Michael Harris's home stood at the very end of the road, its back turned toward the forest. where the wind moved through dry branches and produced a constant whisper that never truly stopped. Michael had lived there for nearly 10 years, ever since his wife passed away. Since then, the house had felt strangely hollow, even though the sound of a child's footsteps still echoed through its rooms each day. His 7-year-old son, Evan, was the only reason Michael managed to hold on to a sense of routine. Every morning, he drove Evan to school. Every evening, he cooked a simple dinner, and afterward they sat together in front of the television until Evan grew sleepy. Life might have continued that way, quietly and uneventfully, if not for the soft conversations that began to surface late at night. At first, Michael dismissed them as childish habits. Evan would sit up in bed, speaking to the empty air, sometimes giggling, sometimes whispering as though arguing with someone unseen. When Michael asked who he was talking to, Evan answered casually that he was speaking with his older brother. Michael laughed it off. Evan was an only child. He assumed his son had created an imaginary friend, something psychologists often described as normal at that age. But unease crept in when Evan's descriptions became disturbingly specific. The boy said his brother's name was Daniel. He said Daniel liked wooden toy trains, hated bright lights, and was terrified of being left alone in the dark. Evan spoke of these things not as inventions, but as memories. One evening, while Michael was washing dishes in the kitchen, Evan suddenly asked in a small voice, "Dad, why did you promise and then never come back?" Michael turned around, his heart skipping. "What promise?" Evan looked at him, his expression strangely distant, then shook his head. "Daniel was just asking. He said you promised to come back, but you didn't." A chill ran through Michael's spine. He told himself it was nothing more than a child's imagination, but from that night on, other things began to feel wrong. Toys appeared where Michael was certain they hadn't been left. An old wooden train lay in the living room one morning, even though Evan insisted he hadn't brought it downstairs. The attic door sometimes stood slightly open, carrying the smell of old wood and dust, even though Michael clearly remembered locking it. Evan changed as well. He refused to sleep alone, clutching Michael's arm whenever the lights went out. He whispered that Daniel was standing in the corner of the room, watching them. When Michael asked what Daniel looked like, Evan went silent for a long time before answering that his brother looked just like him, only thinner and much sadder. Strange dreams began to haunt Michael. He dreamed of standing in a dark room, a cold key in his hand. Knocking echoed from the other side of a door, faint at first, then growing louder, mixed with a voice he could not fully hear. Each time he woke, his shirt was soaked with sweat, his heart racing as though he had fled from something buried deep in the past. One weekend, Michael decided to clean out the attic. He planned to sell the house and start over somewhere else with Evan. The attic had been neglected for years, packed with dusty cardboard boxes. Inside one of them, Michael found old children's toys, chipped wooden blocks, faded stuffed animals, and a small wooden train missing one wheel. An unsettling sense of familiarity washed over him, as if he had held these objects long ago. At the bottom of the box were several crayon drawings. The pictures were crude, of a house, a tall man, and two children standing side by side. In the corner of each drawing was a name written in uneven letters, Daniel H. Michael sat down hard on the attic floor, his head spinning. He continued searching and uncovered a yellowed envelope. Inside was a copy of a birth certificate. The child's name was Daniel Harris. The birth date was exactly 2 years before Evan's. The name had been crossed out with thick black ink, the paper torn by the force of the pen. Michael's heart pounded. He had no memory of this child. Yet as he stared at the paper, a sharp pain split his head, as if something were forcing its way up from the depths of his mind. Blurred images surfaced, a hospital corridor, harsh white lights, the distant sound of a baby crying. He clutched his head, gasping. The fragments began to assemble, no matter how hard he tried to resist. Daniel had existed. Daniel was his first son, a child who was difficult to calm, overwhelmed by the world. Back then, Michael had been exhausted, alone in this house, while his wife slowly withdrew from them both. One winter afternoon, when Daniel would not stop crying, Michael carried him up to the attic and closed the door, telling himself it would only be for a few minutes, just long enough for both of them to calm down. He went downstairs and sat in silence, his mind blank. When he finally remembered and ran back up, the attic was unbearably quiet. The memory broke free completely. Michael felt his legs trembling, the attic floor tilting beneath him. He did not know how long he sat there before he heard soft footsteps behind him. "You found it, Dad?" Evan's voice sounded different. Michael turned. His son stood at the top of the attic stairs, his face no longer carrying its usual innocence. The dim light cast strange shadows across his features. "Why are you up here?" Michael asked, his voice hoarse. Evan stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the paper in Michael's hand. "Daniel says you forgot him for a very long time." Michael shook his head, tears spilling freely. "I'm sorry." Evan tilted his head, a thin smile forming. "Sorry to who?" In that moment, Michael caught their reflection in an old mirror hanging on the attic wall. Evan stood beside another boy. The second child was thin, his skin pale, his eyes empty as they stared straight at Michael. The broken wooden train rested at their feet. "You forgot him again," Evan whispered. "Daniel doesn't like being forgotten." The attic light flickered, then went out completely. In the darkness, Michael heard the soft rolling of wooden wheels across the floor, over and over, like a game that would never end. Months later, the house was sold. The new family claimed they often heard children playing in the attic late at night, even though they had only one child. No one ever saw Michael Harris again. Some say that if you stand outside that house long enough after dark, you can still hear two young voices whispering together, calling for a father who chose to forget what should never have been forgotten. The pit in the woods. The darkness of the Vermont forest descends quickly, without mercy. It swallows the last vestiges of the faint yellow light of October, leaving Hollow Oak Manor isolated in absolute solitude. This was the place Alara Vance decided to settle. She was an independent researcher, an ardent logician, who craved complete stillness to finish her long-term local history project. Hollow Oak Manor, a massive antique Victorian wooden house, hidden deep down a forgotten dirt road, and priced impossibly low, seemed like the perfect choice. Alara had been settled for 3 days. The house smelled of old wood, dust, and a strangely unpleasant, sickly sweet mildew. She had rented the entire house, knowing that Mr. Silas Thorne, the taciturn landlord, lived only about a mile away. The daytime silence was astonishing, the kind of stillness that made one feel as if time had ceased. But when night fell, that silence was torn apart by something beneath the floorboards. It was a deep, resonant sound. Initially, Alara thought it was the wind rushing through empty pipes, or the ancient furnace grumbling. But over time, the noise became clearer and more deliberate. It sounded like heavy metal being dragged across an earthen floor, interspersed with a rhythmic, slow banging, and sometimes, only sometimes, a muffled, choking groan distorted by the thick wood. Alara called Mr. Thorne the next morning. His voice was old and monotonous over the phone. "That's the basement, Ms. Vance. It's permanently locked and unsafe. The old heating system, the plumbing, it's all broken. You're just hearing the wind in the empty pipes. Don't try to go down there." His instructions sounded less like a warning and more like a cold command. However, Alara's curiosity was stronger than her obedience. Every scientist, every researcher, knows that where a secret is hidden, there the answer lies. On the 5th night, the strange occurrences extended beyond her hearing. As Alara worked at her desk, she noticed a faint, pale white light flickering through a small gap in the floorboards right under her feet. It pulsed randomly, as if someone were using a flickering flashlight right below. Simultaneously, a vile odor began wafting up through the cracks, an indescribable mix of wet clay, rusted metal, and something organically putrefied. But what truly chilled her were the footprints. She woke up at 3 in the morning. Turning on the light, Alara saw tracks on the dusty wooden floor in the living room, where she kept her research materials. They were footprints made of a tacky, gray ash powder. They started at the floor gap where the light flickered, and led directly to the foot of her bed. The tracks did not have the clear shape of a human foot. They were rough and deformed, as if belonging to a creature moving on all fours. Yet occasionally they abruptly shifted into a shape closely resembling a human soul. They were not mud, nor simple dust. They were gray ash. Alara thought this must be a prank, or someone had broken into the basement without her knowledge. Her resolve to uncover the secret solidified. She began researching local history. After hours of digging through online archives and obsolete materials about the area, she found old articles concerning Hollow Oak Manor. She was stunned to discover that at least 3 previous tenants, including a historical researcher named Sarah Jenkins, had mysteriously vanished over a span of 2 decades, leaving no trace. Police found no bodies, no signs of forced entry, no clues. The articles referred to it as the Quiet House because of the silent way the victims disappeared. Mr. Thorne had deliberately concealed this truth. Anger and fear mingled within her. Alara knew she couldn't call the police. They would think she was delusional. She had to find the truth herself. With a pair of bolt cutters and a spare flashlight, Alara located the cellar door, tucked away in a dark corner of the kitchen. It was a heavy, ancient wooden door, sealed with a massive lock and rusty metal bolts. After over half an hour of struggling in silence, the lock clicked and fell. The door opened, and a strong wave of putrid stench assaulted her face. The odor was far denser than what wafted up from the floor, forcing her to cover her nose and cough. Alara descended. The basement was not a place for storage. It was a damp, completely empty space with an earthen floor and old stone walls. There was no heating system, no broken pipes as Mr. Thorne had claimed. And most importantly, no one was hiding in the shadows. But the basement was not entirely empty. In the center of the cellar lay a large, jet-black, rough monolith, carved from a strange material that looked like volcanic rock but radiated an unnatural coldness. This stone was densely engraved with spiral symbols and markings resembling an ancient, unknown script. The monolith itself was the source of the faint, flickering green light she had seen from upstairs. Surrounding the monolith, Alara discovered a ritual circle drawn with the gray ash powder, the same substance that made up the footprints upstairs. On and inside the circle were strange items, small animal bones, or perhaps deformed human bones, deeply rusted metal objects, and a broken, handheld tape recorder. Alara approached the monolith. Immediately, the groaning and scratching she had heard upstairs became clearer and echoed throughout the cellar. However, it was not a human sound. It was like the extremely powerful vibrational resonance of the monolith, a sound that penetrated her very bones. She pressed her ear against the stone. It was icy cold, and then she heard it. It was a choral voice, countless whispers layered upon each other, as if hundreds of people were trying to speak at once through a static-ridden speaker. They repeated a distorted, desperate phrase in English. "They are outside the loop. Feed the dust. Feed the dust." Panic-stricken, Alara stepped back and picked up the tape recorder. Using her researcher's skills, she managed to fix it. Finally, the machine sputtered, and then a familiar, shaky voice spoke, the voice of Sarah Jenkins, the missing researcher. "Day 7, Sarah whispered. "This monolith is not stone. It is a mouth. It requires creative energy, life. Mr. Thorne is not the landlord, he is the keeper. He seeks those obsessed with solitude and research, those who can be easily assimilated." Sarah's voice became frantic. "They are not dead. They are assimilated to power it. The monolith uses the gray dust to create footprints. That's how it communicates and moves. It is looking for a new connection. I tried to study it to escape, but I think I've gone too deep. I saw the light from inside the wall. They're calling my name. I have to go." Suddenly, Sarah's voice turned into a desperate, insane scream. "It's coming. It's crawling up the floor. Don't look at the light. Don't look at the—" Then came absolute silence, leaving only the static of the finished tape.